My name is Dr. Allen Lim. I am an exercise physiologist. I've worked in pro cycling for most of my life, for most of my adult life. I'm currently the founder of a company called Skratch Labs, and for fun, I guess, as a hobby, I help train Pro Tour riders.
Come on, TJ, everything you got. Come on, rip it. Everything you got, this is it. Great job, TJ, great job.
So we're in beautiful Andorra ahead of the Tour de France, doing a little training camp with Tejay van Garderen and a few of the EF pro cycling riders, getting them trained up for the tour.
This is what we do all day. We just sit here and hang out and get fat. This is what we sacrifice our bodies for.
Over the last 3 days, we've done a big block in the mountains, and we have been using e-bike by Cannondale to simulate essentially what happens when they're racing in the mountains.
I think we were just kind of spitballing ideas and bouncing things around, and I was talking about how a lot of these teams, they'll just line up their whole team on the front on the climb, and it's basically like you're getting dragged to whatever pace you have to do. So we tried motor pacing with the scooter on the climb, but the scooter was always a bit too harsh. You know, if you would accelerate too quickly, you'd be dropped. And if you would tell them to ease off a bit, you know, it'd be too slow, and it was hard to feather. Motor pacing on a scooter is perfect for flat rolling roads, and we're just like, oh man, how can we get this scooter feel on a long climb?
Legs actually feel not too bad, but after yesterday we were going pretty good. Feel a bit tired today, but it's going to be a good day.
And how do you feel about doing your first tour? You nervous? You feel excited? What do you feel?
I'm stoked, man. Back home in Canada, everybody, not many people know about cycling, like pro cycling. However, a ton of people know about the tour. Even that's what I followed when I wasn't a cyclist. So when I go back home right now, and someone asks me, what do you do for a living? I say, I'm a pro cyclist. And they go, oh, so you've done the tour then? And I say, no. And no matter what I can say about my previous results, I'm not validated in their eyes as a cyclist. But I'm stoked to be doing it just so I can go back home and say, yes, I have done the tour.
So in the tour in the mountains, you've got to be able to hold somewhere between 5.9 watts per kilogram all the way up to like 6.5 watts per kilogram for sustained periods of time, anywhere from 5 minutes all the way up to half an hour or more. For a rider like TJ, who races somewhere between 69 to 67 kilos, that's a serious amount of power, right? That's like, geez, 420 watts plus. The tricky part though is that in these climbs, it's not just about being able to hold really high power output, it's also being able to surge up to about 500 or 600 watts every time you go around a switchback or every time there's a little bit of an undulation in the road. What you see behind the peloton or in the peloton in the mountains might look like a smooth line of riders going really, really hard, but it's far from smooth. There's a bit of a whiplash that occurs every time they go up a switchback. There's a big undulation, and so the power profiles are actually really variable. They're up and down. There are these big spikes, and so it's high sustained power outputs with the ability to surge. That is ultimately what we're after, and nothing simulates that like drafting behind a rider who is basically just going all in. In this case, it's Tim Johnson on an e-bike. Tim and I have been friends for a really, really long time. He's really unique because he's one of these bike racers. When you're at the limit, when you're going as hard as possible, he can still think. He still is situationally aware. That's made him such a great cyclocross rider. He could be on the rivet, but still know how to take a corner, how to take a line. So he ends up being the perfect training partner for a guy like TJ, except that Tim, instead of using just his own legs, he's using his own legs, his skills on a motorized e-bike.
It's kind of funny because sometimes it alternates between I really feel like I'm doing something totally foreign, and then other times when I'm doing something that I've been doing forever that it just feels totally normal. So it's kind of weird how it alternates back and forth. It is motor pacing, but it's with an e-bike. So it's motor pacing to me is like a large, older Belgian gentleman on a scooter or a derny smoking a cigarette, motoring along down a flat road.
Normally we use a scooter on the flats to simulate the speeds that you see in racing, but the scooter doesn't really work when you're going up super steep climbs. And today these teams and these riders are so powerful that the speeds that they're holding on these climbs can't be simulated unless you've got a rider who essentially doesn't get tired. And the only way that you can make that happen is to have a rider on an e-bike.
What we're trying to do out there is to recreate a moment or a period of time in the race. It's going so hard that you can only think about the next K and the next K and the next K. And as TJ said yesterday, it's like having sky on the front, but they're just never stopping ever. And that's what you got to do, is to like buckle down and hold the wheel no matter what. And then when you feel good, like today, then you can attack and try and go for it.
On the e-bike, you know, the person obviously has to pedal, so he can feel, he can almost feel the same effort that you're doing. It's quiet, so he can hear your breathing. And it's really easy to control, really easy to just lift gradually the pace or back it off. But it gives perfectly that feeling of being behind one of those teams that's just dragging you up the climb and you're being yanked by a collar, you know.
This is like the best parts about riding a road bike in the mountains without actually having to suffer as much. So I'll take it. It's the best.
It feels like you're in a race. I was getting in like the race headspace. Like count down the Ks.
It's really easy to go out on a climb and just keep a steady pace for 10 minutes, and you know, you feel great, but that's not realistic on how things are raced. And the e-bike is the most realistic race experience that I think we've come up with.
It's very, very similar to racing in that you're utilizing a team. You're asking riders to break the wind for you. Even though you might be going uphill, the drafting is still very important, and that element of being able to focus on one rider's wheel is very, very important. And so Tim and TJ are talking to one another, trying to create something that feels really realistic to a race scenario.
Hitting the final climb of the day, first K is really stiff, is like the final lead out guys kind of get blown apart from the other teams. And then you settle into a really high pace, and then the last K and a half, 2K is really high speed, really high intensity. And so that's the point where I was not listening to TJ as much. But I mean, today he attacked twice in the final K, which I think was, you know, part of his plan. But you know, that's in a race scenario, in a race situation, for him to attack is exactly what you hope for. You know, if you feel good and you want to go for it, then you go for it.
See if you can just super domestique and bring these guys up gentle. Use Woods as the breakaway, as the attack. Give Woods some gap and then pace Joey back on. Do some game shit.
So one of the goals of this last 3-day block of training here in Andorra was to create effectively the hardest 3 days in the Tour de France. What would that look like if there were a series of 3 days in the mountains that would make or break placing in the Tour de France, whether as a domestique or whether as a leader? What would that look like? What we know is that looks like somewhere between 10,000 to 14,000 feet of climbing, so that's one big metric, in the range of 4,000 to 6,000 calories burned during that workload. We know that there are going to be climbs that last between 20 minutes all the way up to 60 minutes. There are different pitches, there are different steepnesses, and there are different race tactics that happen which create different demands. And so we're looking for sustained power outputs of 6 watts per kg or higher. We're looking at surges that cross 7 watts per kg, and we're looking at maybe a total average for the day of around 200 to 250 watts. That's a huge amount of work. It's super challenging. It's cool that we have the metrics to understand what that is, but the reality is that we're also trying to get Tim, TJ into the environment where the Tour actually happens. And in Andorra, you have so many climbs that are iconic to the Tour de France, that have been raced in the Tour de France, and there are so many kind of race scenarios that have played out in these mountains. And so it's super easy to get into the mindset of what's going to happen in the Tour, as well as into accomplishing the metrics that we need to. The Tour de France has become so competitive, and getting these riders prepared for the Tour is such an extreme challenge. For me, what I really love doing is trying to find an innovative way to help in that process. For me, the innovation has really been one of the big kind of joys in trying to understand human performance and help athletes be their best. It's not so much about the win or the loss, but how can we be more creative about the process? With that in mind, one of the goals of this show is to bring you behind the scenes of that innovation, behind the scenes with respect to performance on both a scientific level and also on a very human level. Because ultimately, it's not just about the science and the technology, it's also about the person behind that science or innovation. It's also the human stories that drive us to really love sport. For me, it's not so much about cycling, it's not so much about the Tour de France, but it's about the human drive to be better. So stay tuned.